Okay. So, what I'm going to try to do today is to wrap up. We'll see if I hit my mark. We're um, actually in good shape, if you believe it or not. I'm going to cover 3 more units. You're going to cover 1 more. We're going to cover 2 before the February break and 1 after. And then it's into test preparation. So you're actually, the end is in sight from the tunnel. But it does mean I pick up a little bit of speed. Yesterday I felt like as I was picking up speed, I muddled through this. And I want to just, because I think it's really important to think about criticisms of the Electoral College and potential kind of reforms to go over it one more time. We'll do it quickly, but hopefully the repetition draws things out. So, again, if you were to define up the Electoral College, you should start with the historic intent. You should then talk about how that altered with the advent of political parties. What that invariably kind of leads you to is that it is more of a rubber stamp. And people, don't like the false mechanism of it. But what they're really upset with it often is the numerics. What you want to include in any definition with the Electoral College is the numerics, the numbers of it. And in particular, the numbers as affected by the winner-take-all system. So if we have 538 total electors available based on the formula for representation, and if 48 of the 50 states award those electors on a winner-take-all system, it does lead to some skewed results and some skewed campaigning. So if I were to criticize, I would say that, yeah, you're voting for electors, and that feels artificial. These electors are bound, typically in terms of how they're selected. You pick diehards that normally 99.9% of the time vote as directed, but you do have the potential for, not only is it not direct, but you have this potential for faithless electors. But as you dig into it more, what the frustration might be is that there isn't this one man, one vote necessarily, that as we do the conversion into, there is a one man, one vote. I want to be careful about that. But what I'm suggesting is as you kind of use that formula for representation and as you award them on that winner-take-all system, it feels like the votes aren't equal. It can skew the results. So in particular, what we're talking about is winning those 11 states, those 11 largest states in a very narrow margin, perhaps even with just a plurality if there's multiple candidates, but getting 100% of those electoral votes and then losing the other states in a landslide. And so what it opens up is the possibility of, winning the election but losing the popular vote. And you can see we've got, multiple examples of that. This possibility gives certain states what is seen as an unfair advantage. It gives certain demographics what is seen as an unfair advantage. Again, you're going to go to certain states because that's part of your mathematical formula. All states perhaps have value, but you've got limited time, limited capital. You're gonna make sure that you're spending your resources wisely. So you're going to go to what type of states in particular? Let's just make sure we get the terminology down there. Where are you going to go, Katie? Swing states. What did I call them as well? In case they just battleground states. Just sometimes the test throws you a different term and it throws people for a loop. So, hopefully we're able to navigate that and see that, that's a synonym if you haven't been exposed to it. So we're going to go swing states and battleground states. What other, state would we typically go to, ideally if it's in play, or maybe just to make the other side spend its resources? Where do you get the most bang for your buck? Yeah, the big states, the ones with lots of electors, okay? Again, don't say you wouldn't go to, don't be absolute and say, I would never go to a small state. That might be part of your formula, right? Okay, so if that's the case, like I said, we're skewing how we campaign. One of the tangential issues, but a really important one too, is when we look at this model, with the winner-take-all system, it really skews things to the two-party system. Third parties really struggle. They struggle in part just to get on the ballot and raise funds because that's based on viability and demonstrating viability in a previous election cycle. So I think there's an understandable rationale for this. Just someone who wakes up one morning and decides they want federal money to promote their political cause in the form of a political party maybe shouldn't garner federal funds and our time and attention. I do think that there's a lot of people out there with different beliefs and attitudes, and a political belief ought to rise to a certain political or a certain threshold for time and attention. So the viability standard makes sense, but it's a definite barrier. In particular, because it's based on a previous election cycle. It's chicken and an egg, right? How do I get a new political party going if getting on the ballot and receiving funds is based on previous electoral success? I kind of have to, struggle through an election cycle and hope that in the next election cycle, I've done the work that gets me, we'll come back to the idea of momentum, I suppose, okay? The other problem, too, is, again, I try to stress that our political system is set up to perpetuate those rules. We have single-member plurality districts. In congressional districts, we have, again, a winner-take-all system where if, a candidate wins by a plurality or a majority of the vote, they get the seat. We don't award seats on a proportional basis like some other countries do, and that would give third parties a kind of a foothold to begin to change how they get on the ballot and how they receive funds, okay? And, the final and I think most obvious thing is, we've seen a lot of third-party candidates do quite well, but rarely do they capture electoral votes, and even if they do, it's never anything approximating the 270 that you need. So, votes don't translate into anything tangible with the winner-take-all system, okay? And then, they also received less media attention, just as a throw-in. Now, what I didn't get to yesterday was the counter, to this, the why are we emphasizing third-party candidates? You can see this even with the primaries. Bernie Sanders has pulled Hillary Clinton to the left. You see it in the Republican primaries, where again, you've got candidates that are across the spectrum, and they are kind of causing some adjustment in each other's platforms. When you have a third-party candidate, they are going to force the major parties to kind of deal with their issue. I equated it to a game of chicken, remember? Where you got two suicidal people driving head first at each other, and the idea is who's going to cut the wheel first. So, picture the election in 2000 and Ralph Nader is in it. Again, third parties, feasibly might pull from both parties equally, but typically they hurt one party more than the other. So in the case of Ralph Nader, he's going to, more likely hurt the Democratic Party. He's driving headfirst at Al Gore. And the idea is adopt my platform, adopt my issues, give me some concessions, or I'm not going to turn the wheel. And I might cost you the election. If you look at the Republican race, there is this prospect of a third-party candidate, because they don't seem to be reaching what is satisfactory to them in terms of their candidate. You've got momentum for Trump as what seems to be the eventual front runner, but a lot of the party isn't getting behind him yet. And there's the prospect of running a third-party candidate, which would be ironic because essentially it would be, the Republican, it would be two Republican candidates. I can't imagine them adopting some sort of radically different platform. Just the idea is we don't like that particular candidate. So at any rate, what you see is that it does provide, even though third parties can't seem to get electoral success, they do manage to get their issues time, attention, and often adoption. So they do play that kind of valuable role. And again, just like I said, it's important for us to have interest groups and political parties and other places that you can pursue political change on the local, state, and federal level. We always need an outlet. And so third parties certainly give people an outlet for political beliefs, because if you don't have the outlet, what do I like to say we want to do? You burn the place down, right? You don't want to burn the place down. So this keeps us from that. Now, what I also didn't get to is looking at alternatives. And there's a number of different models. So I'll look at the most mainstream kind of, typical model suggested. We may try to figure out how to have you guys, you're going to do, by the way, study guide due tomorrow, right? And again, I'm pushing you guys there because other things start to stack up with, the schedule I just mentioned. We do lose a little wiggle room, and we have to kind of maintain a little bit more of a relentless pace. So what happens is study guide is due tomorrow. You guys start prepping for your reading test, which is going to happen on Monday. And I want you guys, in particular, I can't cover everything, and I feel like I've not done a great job of talking to you about the strategies behind campaigns. So pay attention to that when you read. It will talk about the different positions in specifics. You ought to be able to go into a test and mention, here are some, examples of professionals that work on campaigns and what they do, and identify them by title. You ought to be able to identify, campaign strategies, especially with respect to the media. Pay attention to kind of negative ads and positive ads and inoculation ads and spot ads. I think you guys can kind of pick that up for the reading. And ideally, I want to try to figure out a way for you guys just to have a quick, we might do it during the long block, a quick way to find exemplars of that. Like, what is a debate strategy? What is a convention strategy? What kind of advertisement strategies are there? And just have a couple of classics in your pocket. But do pay attention to that in the reading. I'm going to tell you that, again, with a quarter of the questions on this particular topic, this is the section that makes me a little more nervous than others, and I never feel like I cover it as fully as I should, given their emphasis. So really do pay attention to the reading and see what you can pick up that I haven't covered. And it will mention alternatives. That's how I got on this tangent in the first place. So back to tangents we go. One of the most popular alternatives is just to say, why don't we go with popular vote? Doesn't that make complete sense to go with the popular vote? And I think, it does until you begin to just take it to the next step. So the next step is, okay, popular vote. Do third-party candidates become arguably a little more viable if it's popular vote? Is there the prospect of not just a third party, but a fourth and a fifth? Okay, so what is your threshold, therefore, for saying someone won the election? If it's a multi-candidate race, and it very well might be, then what is your threshold? 30%? Should someone become president by capturing 30% of the vote? Or is it a little higher? For most people that kind of advocate for this model, they do have a threshold, and it's typically around 40%, which, okay, that seems like a reasonable number, but it doesn't seem reasonable to suggest that we would get there the first time. That you'd almost have to have a knockout round. Does that make sense? Like you'd have a bunch of, everybody and their mother wants to run, and you'd have a kind of initial round and knock out the ones that aren't really serious candidates, and then you'd probably have to have some sort of runoff between the two top vote getters. Now, I think you can already see a con in that. We're not even halfway through this election cycle, and are you saturated? More elections, Mr. Hastings. I want more politics. We'll get to that as a con. Obviously, there's time and expense in having multiple elections, but in terms of a pro, it is seen as more democratic. It is seen as, hey, popular vote should be the mechanism we use. Anything else isn't, by definition, as democratic. It does give an avenue for third-party candidates to be potentially more viable. What's interesting is it would change the focus of the campaigns, and I have this as both a pro and a con. You can look at how candidates kind of roll into a state and say, oh, I'm in Iowa. Okay, I'm going to be talking about ethanol and corn subsidies. Oh, I'm in New Mexico. We're going to be talking about immigration. Where am I today? I'm in the Rust Belt. I'm going to be talking about manufacturing. And you can see that as kind of pandering and not being authentic, that I'm basically kind of, going to the highest bidder. So on some level, changing the focus of the campaign to make it more national and more generic, or more general, I shouldn't say generic, might be a pro. It is going to be a con as well, though. So I suppose I'll flip to the con right now. The con is, shouldn't states be getting their issues being paid attention to? I'll come to it again, but I keep coming back to the idea that as much criticism as our electoral system gets, it is consistent with the framers' intent. We're afraid of a concentration of power in the hands of a strong central government. We see the states as a counterbalance. And because states hold such sway in this electoral system, they are a counterbalance. You have to go to these states and talk about their issues. If you took this model away, then I can do just a generic campaign, and I can ignore the needs of California and New Mexico and the Rust Belt and the Bible Belt and so on and so forth, okay? So if I come back to that again when I talk about cons, tell me to knock it off. Like I said, would eliminate, it kind of is rolled into that, it eliminates the advantage of certain states, those swing states, those big states that seem to hold a skewed kind of advantage, those demographic groups that seem to hold an advantage. What I want to suggest, though, is that, again, that's a double-edged sword. That, we think that this makes it more fair. But anytime you switch a system, you're just basically switching the winners and losers. It doesn't eliminate inequity. How would I run a national campaign? You guys just studied demographics, right? Would I kind of crunch the numbers and find a demographic coalition that works for me? And would that be somewhat divisive potentially? Let me go with, let's see, white Protestant females. They make up the women are outnumber men, Protestants outnumber any religious group, and the whites are the biggest group. I'm going to run that's an interesting campaign, huh? White Protestant females, that's the vote I'm going for. Or some sort of other, coalition. So I think it sets up a different system of winners and losers. As I stressed, I think the most important thing to pay attention to is the framers' intent. And I think that we need to kind of pay attention to the fact that we believe in majority rule, but we also believe in minority rights. And sometimes if you can look at programs like affirmative action, past inequity potentially requires a proactive action on the part of government. And on some level, our electoral system is that proactive mechanism. It perhaps does give minority voters an outsized vote as a kind of a block. But that may be one of the few ways that we address previous inequity. So it's hard to kind of argue that, a system that gives skewed power is a way to fix inequity. Inequity is a way to fix inequity, but you're AP, you get what I'm suggesting, yes? Okay. And then again, too, I think that candidates already are not specific. And I was joking about that yesterday, where they say, I'm for the kids, and I like the environment, and I'm pro-defense. In a national generic campaign, it's more like a soda ad. There'd be a jingle and, drink Coca-Cola, it's good for you. There's my campaign. So I think that, again, that's just another, like we talked about states being a counterbalance. Well, again, we want to look at how we campaign and also make sure that we're getting information out there. I already mentioned that it opens up the possibility of a second election, which we don't have the time and the issue for. And as much as we've talked about third-party candidates being important as a vehicle for stability, they give people an outlet. They help hold the two major parties from the center. Too many parties, and you might go past the tipping point. You can look at other systems that constantly have to Israel is a great example, where they govern by coalition governments. And those coalition governments routinely fall apart, and then you have to have new elections and a new coalition government. That may work in systems that have a tradition of that, but I think where our system is more predicated on those traditions of the two-party system and the stability of 2, 4, and 6-year election cycles, I don't know if it would work as well. Okay? A final argument against it is just the idea of good luck for change, right? That this has been part of our entrenched political system forever. And unless you had a model where there was no cons and overwhelming consensus, it wouldn't happen, all right? So that's the biggest, I suppose, argument against it is the ability to get change is near impossible. So it's just academic to talk about it. Okay, so one of the final chunks we have to look at is campaign finance reform. And one of the things I thought about doing, I told you I was struggling with this the last time. One, just because of the content, it's challenging. Two, because it gets kind of sprawling. So I got smart about breaking it down just into questions, and now I got smart about just breaking it down and giving you answers. All right, so we've done this a couple of times. I made you kind of muddle through it as a warm-up. Did anybody sail through it? 100? Raise your hands. I'll spin the camera around, all 100s, right? So did you get stuck more so as we went along, right? What you hopefully know by now is the bedrock, the Federal Campaign Finance Act. And again, what you hopefully have down is just a real clear understanding of a rule of thumb. If I want to prevent undue influence, if I want to prevent, the role of someone trading kind of position for influence or money for influence, what do I do? What's my rule of thumb in terms of reform? How do I fix bad things?
You make it public.
Make it public. Put the public spotlight on it. The counterbalance that you're going to constantly see is, yes, we want to make who's spending the money public, who is perhaps trading former influence for or a former position for influence public. And as I want to make the money public, how do we define up these activities? Buckley versus Vallejo. Come on. What is spending money equal on political campaigns? Speech, right? God help us if we can't get Buckley versus Vallejo in that. We're really in trouble. Provided the money is spent independently. Thank you. It's like being in church here. I get all these, amens and hallelujahs from my chorus. So when we look at, all of this complexity, just remember those two kind of simple rules of thumb because we keep kind of coming back to them, just in different forms, okay? So the Federal Election Campaign Act, that's your bedrock. First step used to be the only step we had to worry about. And it has 4 components that mirror a lot of what I was talking about. Let's reduce the role of fat cats and the outsized influence people with money have by putting a ceiling on how much people can give. Again, I don't think you're going to have to do a dollar for dollar amount. Let's make who's giving that money public. And let's make sure that limit and that public nature is followed to the letter of the law. Let's create a watchdog group to watch, the campaign process, and in particular, the role of spending, right? We're going to create the Federal Elections Commission. In addition, I'm going to supplement the money I took out. Political speech is incredibly important. We think about how much we spend on a Super Bowl ad to let you know that chips are delicious. We ought to be spending something similar on candidates. So we do want to get the message out there. So if I'm taking away private money, let me supplement it with public money. Let me create a matching system where, as long as candidates are raising money in small, and they've shown that they're viable, and they're raising money in small amounts up to a ceiling, I will match it dollar for dollar based on a tax write-off that no one checks the box for. Okay? So that was the initial attempt to kind of reform. Let's put limits, and let's make things public, and let's create a matching system, and let's monitor it. So what happens, like I said, is Buckley versus Vallejo. You know this in your sleep. That establishes that money is a form of speech. The catch is provided it's spent independently. And this opens up a number of loopholes. So previous tests like to kind of do that. What's the reform? What's the case? What's the loopholes? And today we have to go further. But the loopholes would be those issue ads run by PACs, and both, you know, terms are important. PACs are political action committees. If you are a corporation, a labor group, you know, you could be a social welfare group. If you are some entity that is looking to spend money to influence elections, you need to. It is mandated that you form this federally registered group that can be monitored, you know, whose finances are public. Okay, so you got to form a PAC, and one of the things the test likes to talk about is that one of the loopholes is the formation of PACs, and the case Buckley versus Vallejo led to a proliferation of PACs. But what I think it misses is PACs by themselves aren't a concern, I suppose. It's what the PACs are doing, which is running issue ads. Again, the catch is you can spend as much as you want because money is speech provided it's run independently, and issue ads qualify as independent expenditure. I'll kind of jump out of sequence here. In other words, as long as you are running an ad that is about an issue that is tangentially related to a candidate, you're okay. The court specifically identified the kind of, you know, the 7 dirty words here that avoid, vote for, elect, defeat, support, vote against, reject, naming the person in particular, and you are technically running an issue ad, and you can probably, you know, again, I'll have a video that I'll show you guys later on, and it will show you some of these ads. It's amazing how close to the line they come in terms of, you know, what appears to be express advocacy, but is not because they avoid certain terminology. All right. The other loophole it opens up is soft money, and what we had talked about again is soft money is the money that is used for party building activities. Non-election advocacy. So this is money that comes from a number of different sources. It typically goes to state and local committees from the excess federal funds. Again, you know, we focus so much on the presidential election, but there are congressional elections that go on. To show you the importance of the congressional elections, you know, when Obama came in, you know, one of his major policy achievements was the Obamacare, the Health Care Act. The congressional, in particular the Senate elections, almost scuttled that for him. And in particular, the election of Scott Brown, that denied him kind of a cloture-proof majority that could get the legislation passed. You have a Supreme Court nominee that is waiting in the wings. But currently you have a Republican-controlled Senate. Any ability to swing that swings the chances of that Supreme Court nominee. So we focus a lot on the federal level, but what I think we often miss is that federal government raises all kinds of money to the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, and sometimes they funnel money back down to the state and local levels so that they can control those critical races and kind of swing the balance of both local government and state government. Local government controls and state government controls the districting, right? Which in turn sets them up for future success on the federal level. So all that stuff on the lower level is really important. At any rate, there is that money that gets filtered from the federal government down to the state and local level. You know, you can. Other entities can, you know, PACs can decide to give to party committees in the form of soft money. So it's, you know, this is typical, but there's a lot of avenues that soft money comes in, and what you're supposed to do is, again, you know, use it for staffing, use it for party mailings, use it to get people out of to get out the vote. But what you often see it being used for is a way to kind of bolster a party, voter recruitment, getting out the vote in those kind of critical districts. You're seeing it used as a way to kind of try to skew the election results. All right? So in comes, it invariably helps the candidates, as I said there. In comes the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, McCain-Feingold. what it was trying to do was to kind of fix some of the loopholes that opened up. One of the things that was happening, they saw, is once you defined independent expenditures as free speech, that's where all the money was flowing. And how can a candidate compete with the money that is being spent independently? The federal matching system was anemic in comparison. Let's give it a shot at B12. How do you like that analogy? You know, some iron. So we're going to essentially raise, it's called the Millionaires Amendment. We're going to raise the amount that you can give to the federal matching system to try to make it more competitive. This solicitation of soft money and its kind of coordinated use is troublesome. Let's shut that down. Let's make sure that you don't have, remember my stage whisper? Psst. Let's make sure someone doesn't do that and say, give me this money and this is how I can use it. So you can't openly, I suppose you can do it, maybe you can do it with the psst if it's really low. Because what's the opposite of open? Just kind of, using some subterfuge, right? No open solicitation of soft money, and no subsequent efforts by an office holder or someone with the campaign to try to direct those funds. Okay. It also tried to shut down. Okay, if money spent independently is free speech, how do we work around that? And what they try to work around is the outside influence that people with a lot of money have. They seem to have more of a voice than you and I. And they seem to bombard us around the primaries and the general election with all of these ads, right? Is there any way we can kind of, curb that? In particular, what we're focusing on is corporate and labor groups. They seem to be some of the biggest spenders and have some of the most outside influence. So what we're going to do to avoid that loophole of defining it up as an issue ad is we're going to change terminology, because why not make it more complicated, and we're going to call it electioneering communication. We write this legislation, we're not going to fall into the trap of defining, the action so narrowly that there's a loophole, right? We're going to give it a big umbrella term. Electioneering communication. And that's, anything directed towards the elections. And we're going to, again, stress that if a corporate or labor group is running some kind of political ad within a timetable of the primaries and general elections, what we want is identification. We ought to know who's running the ad, who's behind it. Okay? So what happens is I have an initial case that upholds, and then two major cases that will once again open up the floodgates and cause the loopholes to come about. And I like that you guys are writing, because that gives you reinforcement. I shouldn't tell you this yet. I'm going to give you the key. But keep writing. Pens go down. Knock it off. Right. Okay. So when we look at McConnell versus the FEC, initially they're going to uphold the soft money limits, the idea of you can't openly solicit and direct them. Before, they said that how you spend money equals a form of speech, and as long as you're doing it independently, it's fine. What they're looking at here is soft money actually a form of speech? And what they said is, no, it's being used for administrative purposes. That's not really speech. You can probably, through 6 degrees of separation, say that on some level, if I can't build the party, then I can't communicate the party's message, and that restricts speech. But that requires a couple of steps. So, restricting solicitation and direction of soft money, according to the court at this point, isn't overly restrictive. And what it always tries to do is balance competing interests. It will uphold this bigger umbrella term of electioneering communications that are specific to corporate and labor groups. It says, yes, you can target corporate and labor groups with respect to electioneering communication, because again, we're counterbalancing interests, and our responsibility to prevent corruption is greater than the rights of speech in this case. Anytime you have, like I said, a restriction, a reform, there's going to be a loophole. So the major loophole that opens up at this point are the 527 groups. The 527 groups are, again, named for a section in the tax code that gives them a different kind of definition than your typical PAC and gives them different kind of latitude. So they are advocacy groups that have a special classification under the tax code. And because they're different in terms of the type of group, they're not subject to the limits that are placed on PACs in terms of the spending. As long as, again, they spend it independently and on issue groups, and as long as they identify. All right? So again, I can avoid some of the restrictions that have been put on me about who I am and the time frame in which I run the ads and limits that I might face by just finding a different classification. And basically groups that want to influence the political process will shop around and they'll say, okay, a PAC's going to serve my interest. No, I need a 527. No, a 501 will work. Ooh, how about a super PAC? So they're going to basically, each will have a pro or a con, and they'll pick accordingly. What a 527 lets you do, like I said, is you don't face limits, provided you spend independently on an issue. I might decide, no, I don't want to spend on an issue. I want to more directly advocate. A 527 isn't for me. Or no, I don't want to identify. Okay? And that will come next with Citizen United. Remember, my classic example of a 527 is the Swift Boats one. All right? Okay, so here's Citizen United. What we've done with the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the McCain-Feingold, is redefine terminology. We've come up with this electioneering communication, and we've given some specific restrictions on corporate and labor groups. And before, the federal court said, yeah, that's okay. Well, here's the Supreme Court looking at it. And they say, really not okay. Because, again, the precedent that has been set, the tradition that has been set, is that money is a form of speech. And when corporates and labor groups spend money on political advocacy, that's a form of speech. In essence, what they're saying is corporations have the same rights as individuals. Labor groups have the same rights as individuals. You can argue that because they have more money, they have more rights because they get more speech with more money. But, to restrict them in this fashion is inconsistent with how we're allowing others to spend. Okay? So what this allows is any kind of funds used on any kind of ads as long as it's spent independently, as long as it's not coordinated. The only thing they upheld was the disclosure rule. You still have to tell us who you are. Okay, so here comes my next loophole, 501c. And I won't have time to play the video for you today, but it really does a good job of explaining it. This is not every group wants this because you have to be like a social welfare group. Typically what that means is a religious, charitable, scientific, educational group. You're not supposed to engage in political activities, but you do anyways. You just do it kind of, creatively. What a 501c4, I don't think anybody ever wanted the C4. Just call it a 501, and I hope to God you don't get it on the test. But what it allows you to do, because you're a social welfare group, is you don't have to disclose who you are. So again, I, as a corporation, might want to spend on elections, but if I support a radical candidate, what happens to my sales? What happens to my brand, right? So I want to funnel money to these political action committees who in turn can spend money on the elections without damaging my brand. And that's what the 501cs let you do, to spend anonymously. I have this, and we'll go over Citizens United in speech now. Tomorrow we're actually going to transition to tackling some of the essay outlines. So we're almost wrapped up. We got about 3 or 4 more minutes to go. Again, finish the study guides up tonight. We say goodbye to Paul. Bye, Paul. Did you hear, Mo?